Today we will look at how a camera works. What a camera really does is save light on something light sensitive. It may be a film, but today it is most common that it is collected electronically using a light sensitive sensor. The sensor needs a certain amount of light. This is controlled by three factors: shutter speed, aperture, and light sensitivity. We will explain these three in this video. This is a sensor on a DSLR camera. You could call it the heart of a modern camera. Simplified, you can say that the bigger the better. But also more expensive. It's not just the size that separates sensors. Their abilities differ. How good they are at capturing low light, how much noise they generate, and what dynamic range they provide. All these things I will return to later. Here you can clearly see the difference in the size of the sensors. The flat Earth's favorite camera Nikon P1000, Sony RX10 which is a much better advanced compact camera, and Canon 1DX which is a professional camera. I'll make a separate video on sensors later. Now we move on to light sensitivity, as commonly referred to as ISO. ISO is a value that indicates light sensitivity. The higher the value, the more sensitive. The disadvantage of high ISO values is that the images become grainy. How much depends on the sensors. So this is something you have to try with your own camera. How much grain one can handle also depends on what you are going to use it for. If you want to display the image on a website, you can have more grain than if you enlarge the image on paper. The aperture, it is the opening that lets in light. The word usually engages with f. The lower the number, the larger the opening. So an aperture of 2 is much larger than an aperture of 11. Shutter speed is the time the camera is open to let in light. It can be from many minutes to 1,000 parts of a second. The longer the shutter speed, the more light is let into the sensor. So in order to expose an image or movie correctly, you have to set ISO, aperture, and shutter speed correctly. These three in combination should give the right amount of light to the sensor. Cameras have light meters that measure the light. If you use automatic, the light meter controls the settings. If you shoot with manual settings, you get help from the light meter. More complicated is not the basic function of a camera: to let in the right amount of light. But how do you decide if it's the right amount of light? If you look at the brightest parts of the picture, for example the sky, there you usually see clearly if the picture is overexposed. Does the sky have details, or is it a light mass without shades and structure? Here I compare an overexposed image, but a good exposed image. You do the same to see if it is underexposed. Look in the darkest parts of the picture, are there details left, or is it just a dark mass? Here I add an underexposed image. A good tool is histograms. Most cameras have one. But also image processing programs have it. With this, you can clearly see how the image is exposed. Here we see a rather dark picture. In the upper left corner you will see a histogram. The left side of the histogram indicates shadows and the right, highlights. This image is dominated by dark parties. But in this picture it is quite the opposite. Here the light dominates. In this type of histogram you can also see how bright different colors are. In this picture you can see that blue is dominated in the light parts, which is natural. During winter up here in the north, the light is much bluer than in summer. How to expose correctly I will return to several times in this series. To expose an image correctly, you can use ISO, aperture or shutter speed. But what difference does it make whichever one I choose? Let's start by taking a closer look at apertures. The size of the aperture is one factor that affects depth of field. Smaller stops, larger f numbers, produce a longer depth of field, allowing objects at a wide range of distances from the viewer to all be in focus at the same time. A large aperture, small f number, has the opposite effect. The depth of field becomes smaller. In this video, the aperture changes, and you can clearly see the difference in depth of field. Shallow depth of field is often used in videos and photographs, usually to show what the photographer wants us to look at. Here it is the hands that knead the dough that are the bearer of the story. If, on the other hand, you are photographing or filming a landscape, it is a long depth of field you want. The length of the lens also affects the depth of field. I will return to this later. Here's a simple illustration that shows how depth of field works. I will return to this several times in this series of videos. There are good calculators to calculate the depth of field. I put a link in the description. There are also apps for smartphones. This image is not taken in studio. It is taken outdoors in nature. I have flash to make the object light and darken the background. I also have an extremely short depth of field to isolate the object. When I photographed this injured hockey player, I chose a short depth of field. This is because he was the main subject. The audience glimpses blurry in the background. Now we move on to the camera's shutter and how it affects your images. It determines for how long time the camera lets in light. What shutter speed you use has a big impact on your images. A fast shutter speed freezes movements. This cyclist drove about 50 kilometers per hour. To freeze him in the picture, I used a very fast shutter speed. I did the same to catch the surfer and to see all the water drops. In this picture of Dario Colonia, I have chosen a slow shutter speed instead. But in order for him not to be blurry, I have combined with a technique called painting. This means that while I photographed him, I follow him with the camera while I take the picture. The idea is the same as with a short depth of field. I wanted to isolate the skier from the background. I will describe this technique in more detail in later videos. When choosing shutter speed, it's not just what you shoot speeds you have to take into consideration, without also your own shaking. How long a lens you have also puts limits on how long shutter speeds you can use. It is usually said that you can handle shutter speed corresponding to the focal length of the lens. 30 mm, you can use 30 parts of a second. 800 mm you can keep stately at 800 parts second. But modern cameras often have image stabilization, which allows you to keep stately a few more steps. So on the Biedny on image stabilization, you might be able to hold 800 mm lenses steady with a shutter speed of 500 parts of a second. As you understand, you rarely get the maximum out of a camera if you use automatic. In the coming videos, I will give tips on how to handle various situations. Today's cameras can be set in different ways. Often you can set the aperture and let the camera make the rest of the settings, or you set the shutter speed and camera the rest. In the next episode I will give some concrete tips on photography. That's all for now. Finally, if you want to support the channel, visit our store or Patreon page. Thanks for watching.